In the annals of human history, few events have been as perplexing as the Great Sleep Epidemic. It struck without warning. People fell into deep slumbers lasting months. Entire communities were affected. The world watched in horror and fascination. Imagine a world where sleep became a curse, where closing your eyes meant possibly never waking up again. This was the reality during the epidemic. Families were torn apart. Cities ground to a halt. The very fabric of society was threatened. The epidemic began in a small town, but it spread rapidly. Soon it crossed borders and oceans. No one was safe. Rich or poor, young or old, anyone could fall victim. The world held its breath, wondering who would be next. This wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a social and economic catastrophe. Workers couldn't work, students couldn't study, governments struggled to cope. The sleep epidemic changed everything, and its effects are still felt today. The sleep epidemic, Encephalitis lethargica, first appeared in the spring of 1915. A small town in the Midwest USA was ground zero. At first it seemed like nothing unusual, a few people overslept, but then more and more succumbed. Within days, half the town was asleep. Doctors were baffled. They had never seen anything like it. The sleepers couldn't be woken, not by noise, not by touch, not even by pain. They were alive, but unreachable. Their bodies were there, but their minds were somewhere else. As news spread, panic followed. People fled the town, but they carried the epidemic with them. Soon cases appeared in nearby cities, then in other states. Within weeks, it had spread across the country and then the world. Scientists scrambled to find answers. Was it a virus, a toxin, something in the water or air? Theories abounded, but proof was scarce. The epidemic moved faster than research could keep up. And all the while, more people fell into the endless sleep. The symptoms of the sleep epidemic were both simple and terrifying. It always started the same way. The victim would feel unusually tired. Within hours, they would fall into a deep sleep, and they wouldn't wake up. Not for days, weeks, or even months. But this wasn't normal sleep. The victim's brain activity was unusual. They didn't dream, they didn't respond to stimuli, yet their bodies continued to function. They breathed, their hearts beat, but they were lost in a world of their own. The effects on the body were severe. Muscles wasted away. Skin became pale and thin. Victims needed constant care. Feeding tubes and catheters became commonplace. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Families were left to care for their sleeping loved ones at home. Perhaps most disturbing were the rare moments when victims partially awoke. They would open their eyes, sometimes speak, but they weren't truly conscious. These episodes were brief and heartbreaking. They gave false hope to desperate families. And they raised more questions than answers about the nature of the epidemic. The medical community was caught off guard. They had no playbook for this. Hospitals quickly filled up, emergency wards were converted to sleep wards. But it wasn't enough. The epidemic outpaced all efforts to contain it. Doctors tried everything, stimulants, experimental drugs, even electric shocks. Nothing worked. The sleepers slept on, research labs worked around the clock. But progress was slow. The epidemic seemed to defy all known medical knowledge. Society began to crumble under the strain. Schools closed, businesses shut down. The economy teetered on the brink of collapse. Governments declared states of emergency. But what can you do when your enemy is sleep itself? Fear gripped the world. People were afraid to go to sleep. Insomnia became rampant. Some tried to stay awake for days, but eventually exhaustion would win, and no one knew if they would wake up again. The world had become a waking nightmare. Section 5. Notable cases, faces of the sleeping sickness. Among the millions affected, some cases stood out. There was Sarah, the first known victim. She fell asleep while teaching her class. Her students watched in horror as she collapsed. Sarah would sleep for 6 months. She missed the birth of her first grandchild. Then there was Michael, the marathon runner. He fell asleep at mile 20 of a race. When he woke up a year later, his muscles had atrophied. He had to learn to walk again. But he was determined. 2 years after waking, he ran another marathon. Perhaps the most famous case was that of President Chen. She fell asleep during a televised address. The world watched as she slumped over on live TV. For 3 months, the vice president ran the country. When Chen woke, she had no memory of falling asleep. These stories humanized the epidemic. They showed that no one was immune. From ordinary citizens to world leaders, the sleep could take anyone. Each case was a reminder of the epidemic's reach and of the lives put on hold by this mysterious affliction. Section 6. Scientific understanding, unraveling the mystery. As the epidemic raged, scientists worked tirelessly to understand it. Early theories focused on viruses or bacteria, but no pathogen was ever found. Then attention turned to environmental factors. But the epidemic's spread didn't match any known pattern. Breakthrough came from an unexpected source: sleep research. Scientists discovered that the victims' brains were stuck in a deep sleep state. It was as if their sleep-wake cycle had been hijacked. But what could cause such a dramatic disruption? The answer, when it came, was shocking. The epidemic wasn't caused by a single factor. It was a perfect storm of modern life. Stress, pollution, poor diet, and technology addiction had combined. They had pushed the human brain past a tipping point. This discovery changed everything. It wasn't just about finding a cure anymore, it was about re-evaluating our entire way of life. The epidemic was a wake-up call. It showed the consequences of our modern, fast-paced existence. And it forced us to reconsider what really matters. Section 7. Long-term consequences and lessons learned. The sleep epidemic lasted for 2 years, but its effects lingered much longer. Those who woke faced a long road to recovery. Physical therapy became a booming industry. Support groups sprang up everywhere. Society had to adapt to help the survivors, but the changes went beyond healthcare. The epidemic had exposed the fragility of our systems. Economic models were rewritten. Education was reimagined. Even the way we design our cities changed. Resilience became the new buzzword. Perhaps the biggest change was in our relationship with sleep. Once taken for granted, sleep was now recognized as crucial. Sleep hygiene became part of school curriculums. Companies introduced nap rooms. Governments passed laws protecting sleep rights. The epidemic also changed our view of consciousness. The line between sleep and wakefulness had been blurred. This led to new fields of study. Philosophers debated the nature of the mind. Scientists explored the frontiers of brain science. The epidemic had opened up new realms of human knowledge. Section 8. The sleep epidemic's lingering shadow. Even years after the epidemic ended, its impact remained. A generation had grown up in its shadow. They were called the sleep children. Born to parents in slumber, raised by relatives or the state. They carried a unique trauma. Fear of sleep persisted. Insomnia rates stayed high. Sleep clinics became as common as gyms. People used sleep trackers obsessively. Any unusual tiredness caused panic. The memory of the epidemic was etched deep in the collective psyche. The epidemic had also changed our language. Don't fall asleep on this took on a literal meaning. Wake up became a loaded phrase. Even fairy tales were rewritten. Sleeping Beauty was no longer a romantic story, it was a horror tale. But there were positive changes too. The epidemic had forced us to slow down, to reevaluate our priorities. Family and community became more important. The rat race lost its appeal. In many ways, the world that emerged was kinder, more balanced. It was a high price to pay, but perhaps there was a silver lining to the long sleep. Section 9. Modern implications and future concerns. Today, the sleep epidemic is history, but its lessons remain relevant. We now know how fragile our waking state is, how easily it can be disrupted. This knowledge has shaped medical research. It has influenced public policy. It has even affected urban planning. Scientists still study the epidemic. They hope to unlock more secrets of the brain. Could a similar epidemic happen again? We don't know, but we're better prepared now. Early warning systems are in place. Response protocols have been developed. We're vigilant. The epidemic has also left us with new questions. What happens to consciousness during prolonged sleep? Can the mind be active even when the body sleeps? These questions have spawned new fields of research. They've challenged our understanding of what it means to be awake. Perhaps most importantly, the epidemic changed how we view sleep. Once seen as wasted time, sleep is now recognized as essential. We've learned to respect our need for rest, to balance activity and repose. In a world that never stops, we've rediscovered the value of pause. Section 10. Reflections on a forgotten crisis. As time passes, the sleep epidemic fades from memory. For younger generations, it's just a chapter in history books. But for those who lived through it, the memories remain vivid. The fear, the uncertainty, the silent streets, the joy of each awakening. It was a harsh lesson, but a valuable one. Looking back, we can see how the epidemic changed us. It made us more aware of our fragility, but also of our resilience. It showed us the importance of community, of caring for each other. These are lessons we must not forget. As we face new challenges, we can draw strength from our past. The sleep epidemic tested us as never before, but we survived. We adapted, we grew, and in doing so, we proved that even in the darkest times there is hope, as long as we remain awake to the possibilities.